Hi, I'd like to talk briefly about letters of intent. I get questions about these documents at times. I get questions such as, are these binding, are they not binding? Also, I have a term sheet or a memorandum of understanding or a heads of agreement. How is that different than a letter of intent? And let me just make an attempt here to demystify this. Essentially, all of these documents are the same. It doesn't really matter what they're called. The real differentiator is how are they defined in the actual documents themselves. And so there's typically three types of documents, and which one you're using, it should be clearly stated at the heading of the actual document. So there's a non-binding letter of intent, there's a partially binding letter of intent, and then a fully binding letter of intent. So a non-binding one is just as it sounds. It's a non-binding document. It's a summary of commercial terms, essentially. And the parties are agreeing to explore these terms, and maybe they'll enter into an agreement, maybe not. But the purpose of the document is really to ensure that they're understanding each other. Then they can iterate this document internally at their respective organizations and try to seek the approvals necessary for moving the negotiation on to the next step, where perhaps there will be a ultimate deal that is struck that's binding. I suggest in non-binding letters of intent to actually have the language that neither party shall bear any liability if no deal is ultimately struck. The next is the partially binding letter of intent. It's actually quite similar. You have commercial terms that are scoped, that are within the approximation that the parties think a deal could be ultimately closed, but there's some binding elements to the document, and that could be confidentiality clause. It could be how expenses are handled during this evaluation phase. Also governing law, if there's a dispute regarding, let's say, confidentiality, where should that dispute be heard? What are the governing laws? And then what dispute resolution mechanism would be used, courts, arbitration, mediation, etc. And finally, it's the fully binding letter of intent. And this is a document that's used when you have the commercial terms that are really approximated now. I mean, they're quite close to what the parties could ultimately agree to in a final agreement. Then there's some other clauses that are, of course, binding, like the confidentiality, expenses, etc. But there's certain conditions in this letter of intent that should be met before the final agreement is concluded. And it could be a due diligence. It could be that there's a pilot use of whatever product may be, and then it has to achieve certain milestones in order for the deal to be concluded. Whatever the conditions may be, if they're met, then the deal should close under a definitive signed commercial agreement. And if that doesn't happen, then there's consequences often stated in the fully binding letter of intent that we met the obligations under the fully binding letter of intent, and then you didn't countersign the ultimate deal, therefore you have to pay a certain amount of money. So that's it. Non-binding, partially binding, fully binding. I hope this helps demystify these issues for you. And if you have any questions about other types of legal issues that are coming up that you find puzzling, feel free to contact me privately if you'd like, and then I can post a video on that subject. Take care of yourself and good luck with your business and with life, and stay healthy. Take care.